Hey everyone, Eric here. Just before we get to today's show, I want to let you know that we're offering our podcast listeners a special 20% lifetime discount to the China Africa Daily Brief. Now that's the newsletter that Cobus and I produce every day that provides the most comprehensive digest of everything China's doing on the continent and now increasingly throughout the global south. In addition to the newsletter, you'll also get full archive access to the website and the China Africa Experts Network as well. To get that discount, just go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe and use the promo code podcast at checkout. Once again, that's ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SubChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, today we're going to revisit the issue of Chinese loans to developing countries. Now, this has been a topic of considerable discussion over the past few months. There have been a number of reports that have come out from groups like the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University and the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University that all show there's been a dramatic fall in lending from China's major policy banks. Now, if you missed those discussions that we had with Kevin Gallagher and Deborah Browdegum, I highly recommend that you go onto our website and take a listen because they're both highlighting some very important trends. But today we're not going to focus on the amount of money that China's lending, but rather the contracts that are used for those loans. It's remarkable that in the 20 years since China's become the world's largest official creditor, with lending amounts that are now comparable to what the World Bank gives out, we know very little about how Chinese loan contracts are written and what the terms and conditions are of those loans. Now, these contracts are bound by strict secrecy clauses that, for the most part, have kept them way out of public sight, making it almost impossible for anyone other than those who are literally in the room actually signing the documents to know what's in those deals. Of course, and I know some people may say this, there have been a few contracts that have leaked out over the years, but we were never sure if what was in those individual contracts were terms that were unique to that specific deal or representative of a broader trend of how the Chinese actually structure their contracts. Now, Cobus, you said something very interesting in a column that you wrote for our newsletter subscribers earlier this week about how corrosive all that secrecy is for everyone involved. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, it makes it harder for populations in Africa to judge whether the loans taken out by their governments in their name that they will then be on the hook to repay will actually deliver what they want to deliver. And in some cases the secrecy goes so far that it's not only the terms of the loans that are off limits, but even the existence of the loan itself. So it just strikes one, particularly in a context like Africa, where people are both, where populations are both poor and young. It strikes one that decisions are made about their future, their financial future, that they're not consulted in, and that level of secrecy also then makes it very difficult for anyone to really gauge, how effectively those loans have been applied, and how useful they've been.
Well, for the first time, we now have a better, more comprehensive understanding of what's actually in these loan contracts. A new report just came out entitled How China Lends, and they analyzed 100 debt contracts between Chinese state-owned entities and government borrowers in 24 countries for projects worth just under $37 billion. The report was a joint effort by researchers at AidData at William and Mary College, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Germany, the Center for Global Development, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Brad Parks, who's the executive director over at AidData and was one of the authors on that team, He's here to join us, and we're thrilled to have Brad back on the show again after 4 years. Brad, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to be back.
Well, it's great to have you back. Congratulations on the report. It was very, very important. I called it, when I was writing about it, a landmark report because, again, we haven't seen this type of data before. Just before we get into our conversation, I'd also like to acknowledge your co-authors on the report, Anna Gelpern, Sebastian Horn, Scott Morris, and Christoph Trebesch as well. Everybody contributed, and I'm sure there were probably a lot of people behind the scenes as well who worked with you. 3 years it took you to actually do this report, so a lot of hard work went into it. One of the key takeaways from the report is that the Chinese seem to use a very different approach to lending money to developing countries compared to those of other major international creditors. I mean, from the secrecy to the clauses to how the money is filed through to the repayment and whatnot. Give us a little bit of an overview about some of the differences that came out in your research about how the Chinese lend money.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I would summarize the three key differences between Chinese loan contracts and debt contracts that are issued by other bilateral lenders, multilateral lenders, or commercial lenders are kind of first related to confidentiality, second related to seniority and the collateralization of debt that enables debt seniority, and then the final issue that I'll just briefly speak to is this issue of the inclusion of clauses that limit the policy options of borrower countries. So on the first kind of key finding, we do find that Chinese contracts, debt contracts, contain unusually broad confidentiality clauses that bar the borrowers from revealing the terms or even the very existence of the loans. And so, as you your listeners may be aware, sovereign debt transparency, it's a major problem for OECD and non-OECD lenders. However, our analysis in this new report, How China Lends, suggests that Chinese lenders are far more likely than others to obtain broad confidentiality commitments from borrowing countries. We also find that China's debt contracts have become more secretive over time. So there's this cut point we look at debt contracts between 2000 and 2020, and we find this kind of cut point in 2014, which incidentally is the first full year of implementation under BRI, where, from that point forward, all of the contracts include these confidentiality clauses, every single one of them. So, there are a number of reasons why these restrictions are a problem. First, they hide loans from the people who are bound to repay them via taxes. But they also, this kind of hidden debt can also make it difficult for developing countries to resolve debt crises. So Zambia is kind of the poster child for this problem right now. So some of its, biggest private creditors, including bondholders, they're refusing to renegotiate Zambia's debts until they get more information about China's claims and the terms of China's debt restructuring. But the Zambian government is kind of between a rock and a hard place because they previously signed loan contracts with a variety of Chinese lenders that included these confidentiality provisions that prohibit them from disclosing the terms and conditions in those contracts, right? So it really kind of puts the Zambian government in an impossible position, and all of this is exacerbated by the economic shock, brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Because COVID, kind of froze a lot of economies. It sapped tax revenue, and by extension, it sapped the ability of borrower governments to repay their debts, right? So it's just made an already bad problem more acute. Second key finding or takeaway from the report is that Chinese debt contracts do contain provisions that position Chinese state-owned banks as senior creditors whose loans should be repaid on a priority basis. So nearly a third of the contracts that we look at require the borrowers to maintain significant cash balances in bank accounts or escrow accounts. Many times these are offshore lender-controlled accounts. And these are, you can think of these as kind of informal collateral arrangements that put Chinese lenders at the front of the repayment line. And the reason why that's the case is that the access to these bank accounts and escrow accounts gives the banks so-called set-off rights. They can simply dip into their borrowers' accounts to collect unpaid debts. So, what we find is that Chinese lenders seem to prefer to collateralize on liquid assets. We sometimes talk about them as grab-and-go assets, like cash that borrowers deposit in Beijing-based bank accounts or revenue accounts. And these liquid assets are attractive to Chinese lenders because they can unilaterally seize them in the event of default. They don't have to go and try to recover overdue debts through a costly or time-consuming judicial process with an uncertain outcome, right? So when you think about all these claims that have been circulating for years about debt trap diplomacy, a lot of them are premised on the notion that Chinese lenders have a preference for collateralizing on illiquid assets, right? A physical asset like a seaport or a electricity grid. So the story goes what these Chinese banks are requesting as sources of collateral, and we just don't find very much evidence for that in these 100 contracts that we gained access to. They really seem to value these liquid assets that don't require going before a judge to try to recover your debts. The other thing that sort of positions these Chinese lenders as de facto senior creditors is the inclusion of what we refer to as no Paris Club clauses or no comparable treatment clauses. And these are clauses that effectively prohibit the sovereign borrower from restructuring their debts to China in coordination with Paris Club creditors, or some of the clauses will prohibit the borrower from restructuring their debts to China on comparable terms with any number of official creditors or commercial creditors, including the IMF and the World Bank. So these two things in conjunction, the use of the liquid assets as collateral and these clauses that basically say if you get in over your head and you can't repay your loans, you can't go. Don't expect us to show up at a multilateral forum where we renegotiate terms in a way that is that ensures some degree of comparability across all your creditors. We're going to negotiate head to head bilaterally, right? So the takeaway, right, for the borrower is not all of my creditors are created equal. If I get in over my head, I have to repay. Some lenders, if I only have so much money and I can't repay all my lenders, I'm going to repay some first, right? And if some of my debts are collateralized and other debts are not collateralized, of course, I'm going to pay the collateralized ones first.
But that's not exceptional, though, right, in bankruptcy. Even in the United States, a bankruptcy judge does not treat all creditors the same. There is a hierarchy of creditors, and so it's not that exceptional, right?
Well, that is true, but, really for the past 60, 70 years, in the world of sovereign debt, there's this kind of de facto international norm of not asking for collateral, right? In general, when the World Bank or the IMF or other official creditors lend to developing countries, they by and large do not ask for collateral precisely because it can trigger this kind of arms race where every creditor wants collateral, right? And so for a long time, there's been this kind of unwritten rule that no one's going to ask for collateral, and then when a developing country borrower gets into trouble, we're all going to come together. That's the whole reason that the Paris Club exists. You bring all the creditors together to negotiate with the borrower at the same time and ensure comparable treatment of these different debts across creditors. China's never been a part of the Paris Club. They've received invitations to join. They've participated as an observer, but they're not fully invested in the system, right? So in that respect, maybe we shouldn't be terribly surprised that there are these explicit prohibitions against, rescheduling through the Paris Club, but it doesn't make it any less challenging for developing country borrowers. And then, the third big takeaway from the report is that these Chinese debt contracts, somewhat surprisingly, include clauses that really seem to be seeking to limit the policy options of borrower countries. So they include broadly defined cancellation rights and repayment acceleration rights in the event that the lender disagrees with the borrower's policies. So, for example, if a borrower was to enact new regulations or legislation that negatively affected Chinese interests, which tend to be defined very broadly in these contracts, that borrower would face the risk of loan cancellation, even if those Chinese interests are completely orthogonal to the specific project supported by the loan. Okay. The other thing that is kind of unusual is that these contracts include rather expansive cross-default clauses and cross-cancellation clauses that can make it difficult for the borrower to exit individual projects, without risking a sort of cascade of defaults. So, for example, China Development Bank contracts, they identify the cancellation of any PRC investments in the borrower country, again, irrespective of whether they're related to the loan or the project supported by the loan. They identify the cancellation of any unrelated PRC investments as an event that can trigger accelerated loan repayment. And similarly, CDB treats termination of diplomatic relations with China as an event of default. So, these things, these clauses have the effect of sort of binding the borrower, and it's kind of a lock-in device, if you want to think of it that way. We also find that these Chinese debt contracts include stabilization clauses that limit borrowing countries' kind of room to maneuver if they want to reform their labor laws or their environmental laws. And these stabilization clauses, they're quite common in no-recourse commercial project finance, but they're very rarely observed in government-to-government lending arrangements, right? So the idea is, like, if you're a commercial lender and you are extending credit to a sovereign borrower, and that sovereign borrower during the course of the implementation of the loan decides, we're going to alter our labor or environmental laws in a way that is going to impose new cost on the lender, then, the idea of these stabilization clauses is that the lender gets compensated for those unanticipated cost increases. But it's rare for official lenders to include these types of clauses in their contracts, because in part because now you're talking about one government entity telling another government entity what they can and cannot do with respect to their labor and environmental policies. And then the last thing that kind of, the last clause that kind of falls under this banner of clauses that constrain the policy autonomy of the borrower are these clauses that allow for loans to be terminated in response to a vaguely defined policy change in the debtor country or in the creditor country. So the policy change clause, if you're not familiar with these, they traditionally help commercial creditors manage the risk of new legislation or international sanctions that are kind of outside of their control. However, when the creditor is a government agency, And especially when the creditor has a say in policy making, the inclusion of one of these policy change clauses effectively becomes kind of a free exit option, right, for the creditor. So these are all different variations on the same theme of clauses that limit the policy options of the borrower countries. So traditionally we think of Chinese lending as being free from conditionality, and it is free from conditionality in the traditional sense that when people associate when people think of conditionality, they oftentimes associate it with things like governance-related conditionalities requested by the World Bank or the IMF. We don't see anything like that, but we certainly do see some levers, policy levers in these contracts that are designed to constrain the policy discretion of the borrower government. And I think we didn't fully appreciate. I think it was not commonly understood that these levers exist until we got inside the four corners of these contracts.
Circling back to the issue of secrecy, I can see from the Chinese perspective why they would want to keep the terms of the loans secret. But why? What is the kind of motivation for them to keep the entire existence of the loan itself secret?
I don't know exactly why that is the case. I think that we have seen individual examples of the existence of a loan and the terms of a loan spilling into public view, and it creating a major headache for these banks that they have to manage. So, for example, in Ecuador, there was a very prominent case where China Development Bank was negotiating a $2 billion oil-backed loan with Ecuador's Ministry of Finance, and they requested that the Ministry of Finance sign a side letter that is separate from the loan agreement itself, which is essentially, it's called a confidentiality letter, but the letter codifies a set of confidentiality undertakings that the borrower agrees to. And the Ecuadorian government signed this letter, and no sooner had it signed the letter and the ink was still drying on the letter that somehow the terms and conditions and the scale of the loan was disclosed through a video that went viral in Ecuador, and this created stirred public debate and raised questions about the advisability of the Ecuadorian government signing this particular loan contract, which was, the borrowing terms were close to commercial. I think the interest rate was near 7%, so it was rather high for the Ecuadorian government, and so this did place pressure on the lender to explain, the terms and conditions. And I think CDB didn't appreciate that pressure, and they made it known to the Ministry of Finance. So AidData obtained the verbatim warning letter that they wrote to the borrower after the video went online, and the letter, which we've made available through the report. There's a link to the letter there. It says this couple of things. First, it says, this video is inconvenient for us, and we expect the Ecuadorian government to launch an investigation into the public officials who may have leaked the contents of the contract to the media. So that was kind of request number one. There was also a thinly veiled threat to withhold future disbursements under the loan if the Ecuadorian authorities didn't address this issue to the satisfaction of the lender. There was also a rather odd request for the Ministry of Finance to ensure that the country's auditor, the public auditor, release reports on previous CDB loans to Ecuador with, quote, favorable ratings. So essentially what CDB seems to be asking for is the loan agreement that they had just signed in the spring of 2016 was the fourth of 4 consecutive oil-backed loans. And what they seemed to be requesting was for the Ministry of Finance to lean on an independent government institution to release a report that painted the first 3 loans in a favorable light, right? To sort of move the needle on the public discussion about the advisability of borrowing from CDB. That itself led to a huge domestic political controversy because one of the audit reports related to China Development Bank lending was not particularly flattering, and it later was revealed that pressure was placed on the Auditor General from the President's office to make that public audit report vanish. And the audit report, which AidData has recovered and we've made it publicly available, it did vanish from the internet shortly after this dust up in 2016. So, that's sort of a circuitous way of answering your question, but I think it's fair to say that some of these banks have found themselves on their back foot when the terms and conditions and the overall size of their loans has spilled into public view.
It's interesting because the terms do seem rather heavy-handed. One of the emerging narratives that came out of your report in the media coverage was that the loans are very one-sided in China's favor. But allow me to play the devil's advocate here, because
Sure.
when these loans are negotiated, they're contracts. And like any contracts, there are 2 sides. And whether it's the Ecuadorians or Edgar Lungu in Zambia, there's agency on those sides. So if the terms are so onerous that they're not fair, why is someone like Edgar Lungu signing these deals? I mean, again, this is a marketplace. No one's forcing the Kenyans, Zambians, Ethiopians, Djiboutians to take these Chinese loans. So if they're that bad, why are they taking them?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. These contracts represent negotiated settlements between 2 parties. There's no imposition of anything upon anyone. However, the parties to these contracts show up to the negotiation with different amounts of information and different capacities, right? So oftentimes when these Chinese banks enter into these loan negotiations, they hire the very best sovereign debt law firms in London and Paris and New York, right? So they're paying for primo legal advice to ensure that these contracts are written in a way that is as favorable as possible for their repayment prospects and for the advancement of their commercial interests more generally. But if you are the government of Sierra Leone, or the Republic of Congo, chances are when you show up to that negotiation, you haven't hired Clifford Chance law firm, in London or Denton's to represent you and, basically have the world's best lawyers thinking about how to protect your interests. So there is certainly some asymmetry when it comes to the negotiations themselves, who represents the governments at the table.
But no one can blame the Chinese for wanting to protect their interests there. And I'm not suggesting that your report does that. Your report is very balanced in terms of not making a judgment like this. But listening to what you're saying, I'm thinking to myself, if I'm loaning somebody money, I do want to make sure I get that money back. That's not unreasonable.
Not at all.
It sounds actually quite smart in many respects. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with what they're doing.
Yeah, no, it is. And one of the takeaways from the report is that China is a commercially savvy lender. They want to be repaid across the board. Chinese state-owned lenders want to be repaid on time, and they want to be repaid with interest. And they use all kinds of creative contracting solutions, right, to pursue those ends. And I don't think they can really be faulted for that. But it is also true that the borrowers do not show up to the negotiating table with the same resources, to protect their own interests. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is that many of these projects are projects that Western creditors and multilateral creditors and commercial creditors are unwilling to support for any number of reasons. And so, that also creates a bit of an asymmetry in the negotiation, in that, these borrowers, it is not as though they can just walk away from the negotiating table and seek financing for the very same projects. Many of the projects that are being supported would by Chinese lenders would not otherwise be financed by non-Chinese creditors.
In the report, you mentioned that in some of the contracts, there is the provision that if disclosure of the loan and the details of the loan is mandated by the borrowing country's laws, then they can be disclosed. And kind of partly some of the work that you did was also drawing on public databases in Cameroon on lending, kind of undertaken by the Cameroonian government. Like on the back of that, like, kind of I've in writing to our subscribers, I suggested that it might be a good idea for a body like the African Union to recommend, like, kind of radical transparency, to recommend to African Union member governments that they should make kind of full transparency about their lending, the law of the land, and that in the process China would have to respond to that. Is it that simple? Like, is it simply possible for borrowing governments to take that step to disclose the loans, and for Africa as a community to move towards kind of like full transparency on lending, or is that not really kind of possible in this current landscape?
I think it is that simple. I think the full disclosure. I mean, the main way in which we obtained these 100 debt contracts is from government borrowers who have laws or regulations on the books that require their foreign loan contracts to be subjected to public scrutiny, right? So, we over that 36-month period where we were collecting these contracts, what we were doing was we were reaching into the debt information management systems of the borrower countries. We were going into the official legal registers of those countries, and we were scouring parliamentary websites of borrower countries. Why parliamentary websites? Because many of these countries have laws on the books that say that there needs to be parliamentary review and ratification of any foreign loan contract, as though it's an international treaty between two sovereign governments. So that's the main reason that we're able to peer inside these contracts, right? The fact that a subset of borrower countries have these laws on the books, and I just think it's a common sense policy rule of thumb for developing countries to follow. I mean, government borrowing, it's really hard to sort of justify why government borrowing should be hidden from the people who will ultimately be responsible for loan repayment via taxes, right? Citizens and taxpayers, they should have the ability to hold their governments accountable for any debt agreements that they've signed. And I mean, this argument really has very little to do with China, right? It's just about public debt needing to be public.
You're right. I mean, I'm a little frustrated right now because the coverage of your report in the New York Times, the Financial Times, and most of the U.S. and European media was all about the secrecy on the Chinese side. And it was decidedly negative on the Chinese side. I'm coming back to what your co-author Anna Gelpern said. She said Chinese lenders come across as hard-nosed negotiators, but their methods are neither unique nor unprecedented. And yet we're not focusing enough attention on the borrowing side. All the burden of the responsibility seems to be on the Chinese side. But as you pointed out, there's a very simple solution here for Zambia, is have the legislature pass a law that then forces transparency on it, much like what, by the way, the Nigerian Debt Management Office does. They should be credited for great transparency on their debts. And this really seems to be more about the borrowers, the story, than it does about the creditor. I'm just I can't muster up the outrage. We're going to get, by the way, to the political ones. That's going to be very interesting. But so far on the economic side of these deals, it feels like the shortcomings are less on the Chinese side, who are taking big risks in loaning to projects that, as you pointed out, the World Bank, the IMF, other Western creditors won't loan to because of any number of different reasons. The Chinese come in and say, okay, you want our cash. It's risky. We want to make sure we get paid back. So we're going to force you to put an escrow account. We're going to have all these other terms and conditions. Take it or leave it. If you don't want it, walk away. And yet they still sign on.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with that, but I think there's a bit of nuance that I want to make sure doesn't get lost.
Sure.
So
help educate me on that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, first off, I should say we don't have any grounds to believe that if these borrowers that don't have such laws or regulations on the books, we have no reason to believe that if they get them on the books, that it's going to impinge upon their ability to borrow from China. So one thing that's kind of notable about our sample is we see serial borrowing, right, with the same lender from the same borrower, with no apparent penalty for having these transparency laws on the books. So going back to the Ecuador example, they do have these laws and regulations, and they've been disclosing their Chinese loan contracts. And remember, I told you they did a series of 4 consecutive big ticket loans, oil-backed loans to the Ministry of Finance in Ecuador, and Ministry of Finance in Ecuador put these loan agreements, or they got out into the public domain in one way, shape, or form, and there was no, that did not result in CDB not lending to them anymore, right? So it's not as though if borrowers were to pursue the kind of radical transparency that you referenced, that it's going to suddenly result in the taps being turned off and, they can't access Chinese credit. I guess the other things I would say is that, we try to be pretty careful in the report to let folks know that what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? If OECD and multilateral creditors want China to be more transparent, they really should lead by example and disclose their own loan contracts, right? So there's also some...
Which they don't, by the way, correct? Very sorry to interrupt you, but the United States, the French government, the UK government do not have websites that publish the terms and conditions, interest rates of their concessional lending. Is that correct?
It's a bit more complex, but I guess what I would say is that they do not consistently disclose the terms and conditions of their loans across the board, right? They do it kind of a little bit here, not over here, right? But we really do not have consistent disclosure of debt contracts from OECD creditors and multilateral creditors. So if they're going to if they want to really push China for greater disclosure, I think they really need to look inward first to make sure they actually have the moral high ground. But the last thing that, I wanted to make sure to get across is that, in this, one of the unique things about this report is that we're not just looking at Chinese loan contracts in isolation. We're benchmarking the terms and conditions vis-a-vis 28 non-Chinese creditors. And so when we do the head-to-head comparison of the confidentiality provisions in the Chinese contracts against the confidentiality provisions in the non-Chinese contracts, we do find that they are more expansive in the Chinese set than in the non-Chinese set, and specifically, confidentiality clauses can bind two parties. They can, or one of two parties. They can bind the creditor from disclosing information, say, to other creditors, or they can bind the borrower, or they can bind both, right? And one of the things that we find about the confidentiality clauses in the Chinese contracts is they're particularly expansive in that they bind what the borrower can do. Right. So that is an important nuance here. So, you could even think of it as China being the worst among equals when it comes to confidentiality. Right. They're not alone. They've got peers that aren't so great on sovereign debt transparency. But, within their peer group, they seem to go even further than everyone else in terms of how kind of ironclad these confidentiality provisions are.
One of the very interesting issues in the report is this kind of overlap between diplomatic relations with China and the terms of individual loans. So within the wider issue of, for example, the way that the clauses that protect the Chinese lenders against changes in policy, do we also see there the possibility of like country X somewhere in the global south suddenly, like some leader suddenly calling, for example, for an investigation into the origins of COVID-19, the way that Australia did, and then facing the possibility of having loans cut off, or for example, or kind of criticizing China on any of its red line issues like Hong Kong or Xinjiang or so. Is it that clear cut that this kind of pushback, diplomatic pushback against certain kind of issues, certain aspects of Chinese foreign policy, can then lead to individual loan contracts being cancelled or other kind of punitive measures being taken?
So one thing I want to make clear is that our analysis is really focused on the contents of these loan contracts, which is kind of a snapshot in time, right, of what the two parties agreed to when they signed on the dotted line. How the contracts are enforced after the fact is a totally separate matter and, a great avenue for future analysis. So the short answer is we don't know, if Chinese lenders are using these contracts kind of as a cudgel to try to achieve broader foreign policy aims. The only inferences that we can draw are based on what we actually see in the text. And from our analysis of the text of the agreements, the conditions really do seem to be focused towards the advancement of Chinese commercial interests, right? So these cross-cancellation clauses and cross-default clauses, a lot of times they're linking to the commercial interests of, quote, any PRC entity, right? So if I've signed, let's say, I'm a borrower and I've signed a $2 billion loan with China Exim Bank or China Development Bank, my project being supported by this particular loan, its fate is essentially being linked to other commercial other projects or commercial investments, that may not even be funded by the same lender. It just happens to be a Chinese project or Chinese investment in the same country. And so essentially what that is doing is it's hemming in the borrower, right? It's constraining the borrower from deviating from what they originally agreed to. So to give you like a practical example of what this looks like, we obtain this documentary evidence through letter correspondence between the Argentinian government and China Development Bank. And, what we found was the Christina Kirchner administration, they went on borrowing spree and, contracted a lot of loans with Chinese state-owned banks. Then when Christina Kirchner exited power and the McCree administration came in, they sort of reviewed the portfolio of loans and they wanted to pick and choose. Okay, they looked at some contracts and some projects being supported by the contracts and said, we like that one, we don't want that, we don't like this one, right? And so they announced that they wanted to suspend a big ticket loan that was financed by China Development Bank. And within a few months of making this announcement, they got a letter in the mail from China Development Bank. And the letter basically said, welcome to power, read the fine print in your contract, because
they really sent it by the mail?
Well, it's a whether they transmitted it. I mean, we have the scanned copy of the letter. I don't know if it was transmitted by post or via email nowadays, but they got a physical letter, and that letter basically says, we'd like to have a good relationship with you. These projects that you're reviewing are high priorities of the Chinese Communist Party. And, we understand that you've expressed your intention to suspend one of the largest projects in the portfolio, but we would really encourage you to go and read the clause in your contract that links the cancellation of this project to the other projects that you don't want to suspend. And, no sooner had they received this letter, within I think a matter of weeks, the McCree administration reversed course and said, never mind, not going to suspend this project, right? And so what's the sort of net effect? The project that they wanted to suspend, suspend on environmental grounds because it was near a UNESCO heritage site. It was a dam project. And so essentially, the bank, China Development Bank, walked them back from promises that they made during the electoral season, right? Environmental promises. They wanted to kind of change the environmental policy direction or orientation of the government, came into power, tried to make it happen, and they were frustrated in their attempts to do that because of the existence of this cross-cancellation clause, which frankly they probably didn't even know existed until they got that letter in the mail.
But again, that's their fault for not reading the fine print. I can't say in my home mortgage that I didn't know that I have to pay on the 1st of the month. I thought I could pay on the 15th of the month. The burden's on me to know that about my own contract. Indeed,
but in a sovereign debt setting when the sovereign debtor is a democratically elected government, when you have turnover, right? You go from one government to another. When the new finance minister is appointed, he or she is not necessarily up to speed on what the previous finance minister signed on to.
Then people shouldn't borrow money from the Chinese. That's the moral of this lesson.
But also, but governments also have the prerogative to keep evolving and keep reshaping their legislation. So for example, in this case around environmental issues.
But then they shouldn't sign deals that box them in. You're right. I agree with you in principle, but I'm just saying then they shouldn't sign a deal that boxes them in, knowing that their governments are dynamic and evolving. It just seems... I don't know where I'm coming from on this, but I'm a little frustrated in the sense that the burden is on the Chinese to not do that, but the burden's also on the governments not to sign bad, bogus deals that are not in their long-term interests.
And I think to that point, my hope is that the publication of our report, if nothing else, will hopefully just kind of get borrowers to wisen up a little bit and think twice before they sign on the dotted line, and make sure that they go over these clauses carefully to ensure that they understand the consequences of what they're signing on to. I think it's the other sort of challenging thing on the borrower side is that Chinese banks sort of position themselves as commercial lenders, and some of these clauses are boilerplate in a commercial lending setting, right? So like a cross-cancellation clause, cross-default clause, very commonplace in commercial lending. But when you're dealing with a political entity, a public sector entity that has kind of broader set of interests that it's trying to protect, then these clauses kind of take on new meaning and new potency, right? And so that's where I think there's just a scope for the borrowers to educate themselves a little bit about, what the implications of these different clauses are.
And Cobus, to your question earlier about whether there's a commercial or a political in the sense, my personal opinion, and again, this is nothing to do with the report, is that there's always a political angle. And the fact that the CDB letter to Argentina mentioned the Chinese Communist Party is evidence of that. And so to me, politics and commerce go hand in hand in China. So I suspect that there is a very strong political angle, although the actors in the contract are economically or commercially driven. That doesn't mean the politics aren't necessarily close behind somewhere there. You did get some reaction from the Chinese government on this. It was mentioned at the regular press briefing by Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Hua Chunying. In fact, Xinhua asked a question about it. My guess it was probably an orchestrated question, and she gave a boilerplate answer that actually didn't address the report, which was very interesting. It talked about their G20 lending, and it talked about all sorts of things that were not actually mentioned in the report. However, Wu Peng, who is the top diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Sub-Saharan Africa, a former ambassador to Sierra Leone and also to Kenya, he addressed you on Twitter and just the group. And let me just read his tweet, and I'd like to get your reaction from it. He said, "I noticed that some scholars wrote a paper titled How China Lends. I'm not a banker, but I was the Chinese ambassador to Sierra Leone just a few years ago. I want to remind the authors of two facts, although they may already know them. The contract for Queen Elizabeth II K project mentioned in the paper has never entered into effect, and this never happened. The project should not be used as a case. Number two, given that it's a public-private partnership, Chinese financial institutions provide loans to a private company, not the government." So Ambassador Wu seems like he's trying to cast some doubt onto your methods and onto the report. How would you respond to the ambassador?
I would say that he has zeroed in on one of the 100 contracts, and just to bring all of your listeners up to kind of a common informational baseline. What he's referring to is a syndicated loan from China Exim Bank and ICBC to a project company or a special purpose vehicle that was responsible for implementing a seaport project in Sierra Leone. The loan was about $650 million. And the authors of How China Lends, when we obtained the loan contract, the unredacted loan contract, we had to make a judgment call in this case because the borrower, he is correct, the borrower is not the government of Sierra Leone. However, the Ministry of Finance of Sierra Leone issued a sovereign guarantee to the borrower, to the project company, essentially saying, if you go belly up, this becomes public debt, right? And so in this case, this would be the single largest loan or liability ever to go onto the Sierra Leonean government's books. It's equivalent to 15% of the country's GDP. For all intents and purposes, to us, this looked like public debt because it's basically saying if this shell company that's been established to implement this project, can't repay the loan just through the revenue generation of the project itself from the seaport, that the Ministry of Finance is standing ready with a bag of cash ready to repay the loan, right? So, and this is a broader issue with Chinese lending. There's a ton of official lending from China that goes to state-owned companies or project companies, but with the provision of a side guarantee from the central government, right? Which essentially creates a contingent liability on the books of the host government. So I think, the official from the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is correct that this one particular contract was not issued to a sovereign borrower, but I think the loan itself sure looks a lot like sovereign debt, or something that could very easily become sovereign debt. In terms of his kind of second argument that the project never came to pass, and so it should not be included in the analysis. I have to say, I just don't agree with this argument because, the focus of our project is not on how projects are implemented. The focus is on how China lends. So the fact that they signed this loan contract and they designed it the way that they did is material, right? That is still something that merits scrutiny. This, again, would have been the largest loan ever issued to Sierra Leone. Very high stakes project. The project, in fact, did enter implementation. There was a project commencement ceremony in November 2017. Initial construction began about a month later. And then when it was revealed that the IMF kind of sounded the alarm that a sovereign guarantee had been issued and this could become public debt, it was also revealed that the owner of the shell company, the project company that was technically speaking the borrower, was an Israeli businessman who had just a year later made political contributions to the president of Sierra Leone, right? So that aroused a lot of suspicion about this arrangement. So I think the combination of the opacity of the debt, the opacity of the sovereign guarantee is really what kind of stopped the project in its tracks. And while it did kind of initially get started, it was halted after some of these controversies emerged. But I don't think that makes the terms and conditions inside the four corners of the contract any less relevant, right? Because it tells us how Chinese lenders seek to craft these arrangements with their borrowers.
The presence of the No Paris Club clauses in these loans puts China in an interesting position in terms of the fact that it's also participating in the G20's GSSI initiative. So I was wondering, kind of a broad question, but I was wondering, how do you think the Paris Club should respond to this way that China is lending, particularly like on the one hand, as you pointed out, kind of it's the simply calling for China to join Paris Club standards doesn't seem sufficient, particularly because there's so many problematic aspects in among other Paris Club members lending as well. It's like there's high levels of opacity on other sides too. So like with China's presence as a big lender now pretty well established, despite kind of fluctuations up and down, how do you think the Paris Club system as it's sitting at the moment, how is it affected by this role of China, and how do you think it should be reformed?
Well, I think the Paris Club creditors are in a difficult spot because they're learning for the first time that, or they're seeing now with their own eyes through the publication of these contracts that they're effectively junior creditors, right? So they had put down their arms, chose not to collateralize, and now, right, and Chinese creditors, right, not bound by any of the norms of the Paris Club. They've been busy collateralizing a lot of these debts. So I think that creates, some real awkwardness, let's say, in the context of the G20's common framework, because Chinese Ministry of Finance officials, they've been signaling recently a willingness to cooperate through the common framework. And I think what our analysis shows is that there's a disconnect between the actual debt contracts that are being issued by the country's state-owned banks and the rhetoric that we're hearing from China's Ministry of Finance in terms of wanting to be a part of the common framework. And so this could simply be a lag between policy announcement and policy implementation. Another interpretation of it is that it's policy incoherence, right? These banks they're big, powerful, relatively autonomous institutions. It may be that Ministry of Finance knows what it wants to do, but it takes time for this to kind of get implemented through the actual lending institutions. And then another, perhaps the least charitable explanation is that there's just a real gap between rhetoric and behavior, and there's some degree of disingenuousness going on. We say one thing in an international fora, and we do another thing within the confines of a contract protected by confidentiality requirements. So I think only time will tell if that gap that we know exists between their rhetoric and their action shrinks, right? So I think that's something we need to very closely monitor. So, my co-authors and I, we stopped collecting these loan contracts just for the purposes of getting the report done, I think third week or fourth week of January. But just in the last few weeks, we've sort of ramped up the contract collection machine again, and we're starting to collect additional contracts beyond the initial 100 for some contracts that were, signed only very recently. And so I think as we are able to review more contracts from 2020 and 2021, that will provide more of an evidentiary basis to say, look, do we see them changing the way that they craft these contracts such that their rhetoric and their action kind of come into closer alignment.
One of your co-authors, Scott Morris, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, he said that the report's findings were, quote, clearly at odds with China's commitments under G20 agreements. So it's interesting that that's the take. And David Malpass, who's the president of the World Bank, he has said repeatedly over the past year that even though the Chinese are participating in the G20 DSSI process, they are still not sharing enough information, and there's not enough collaboration. So there is a big disconnect. At the same time, the Chinese Foreign Ministry keeps coming out with statistics saying they are doing more in the DSSI and they have deferred more debt than any other creditor. So there is this real disconnect, and it'll be interesting to see in the next 1 to 2 years when you guys publish, hopefully, updates on this, because this is absolutely essential reading for anybody interested in understanding China's lending practices. The report is called How China Lends. It was written by a coalition, AidData at William and Mary College, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Germany, the Center for Global Development, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. You can download it at aiddata.org. I have links to that in the show notes. Brad Parks is the executive director over at AidData. Brad, if people want to follow what you are reading and writing these days and to connect with AidData, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Best way to get in touch is probably at info@aiddata.org. We track incoming queries through that email address. And yeah, we'd welcome any and all feedback on the report.
Excellent. And you guys are also on Twitter as well, right?
We are at AidData, AIDDATA.
And are you on Twitter?
I am not individually on Twitter.
Really? You're the 1 or 2 people left in Washington not on Twitter. Okay.
It's the secret to my productivity.
Yes, I can imagine.
I support you wholeheartedly.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Hopefully it won't be 4 years again before you come back and join us. It was really great to speak with you. We had another full hour of questions, but we know we got to let you go with your day. But we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was good fun.
Cobus, for years on this show, we have been saying that the Chinese are playing by a different set of rules. And we, in the outside, don't always understand what those rules are. If you want to understand what that means and what that actually looks like in practice, read this report, because that is the different set of rules that they're playing by. And the fact that we, on the outside, have not taken the time to understand those rules, to me, is the burdens on all of us and on African, Latin American, South Asian borrowers who go into those contracts. And again, they said it over and over again in the report that Chinese lenders come across as hard-nosed negotiators. Now, I'm not saying this to defend the Chinese. I'm not supporting the Chinese. I couldn't care less. That's not the point. The point here is that it's a different set of rules, and I get the sense that people in Paris are clutching their pearls because they're not playing by our rules, and they're not used to being the second in the hierarchy of lenders. And I think they're getting outplayed. I'm baffled by what I heard now from Brad and the coverage that I read in the Financial Times, the Washington Post, and all the media, because total disconnect. He brought a lot of nuance that was missing from a lot of that coverage, where it was just China is onerous in its lending. It is onerous. They are playing by heavy-handed rules, totally. But at the end of the day, it's a contract, and nobody is forcing the Lungu government to accept those terms. There's agency that has to be accountable there, in my view.
Yeah, that's the opposite. That's the other side of the African agency debate, right? It's not only African governments' decision-making power, but also African governments being on the hook for their decisions. So there's a lot there that's about a kind of weak political enforcement in Africa. Governments frequently stay in power, not necessarily because they're good governments, and then all of the secrecy that is also demanded by Chinese creditors end up playing into the hands of African leaders as well. African leaders are addicted to secrecy. It's like a drug in Africa, and so kind of for African civil society, I think to push for more proactive disclosure is a really important step. I think for the future of the continent, but at the same time, I think yes. Like on the one hand, like I agree with you that what we're going to have to see is global governments becoming a lot more scrappy, or like particularly global South governments. I mean, need to become a lot more scrappy and need to drive much harder bargains and need to draw in kind of other resources. Like Brad was pointing out, the Chinese come armed with all of these law firms in Paris and London, and African governments need to do the same. But on the other hand, I think it also needs to force a much wider conversation about lending itself, because as we have been pointing out, there's no point in simply insisting that China needs to join kind of Paris Club conventions, because in a lot of ways the Paris Club conventions are themselves not great. So in that sense, kind of I think, like this is the kind of reckoning that everyone has to deal with, not only the Chinese and certainly not only the Africans.
It also blows a hole in the whole Chinese rhetoric on win-win, because this is not win-win. I mean, there's no way that you can spin these contracts as saying it's win-win. And this has been the criticism of win-win, because it does feel like the Chinese win twice, is that they're loaning the money and then they're also providing the EPC contractors. Those are the construction companies. So everybody on the Chinese side of the ledger is coming up really, really strong. And the African side is getting a piece of infrastructure, but at what cost? And because the fact that other creditors did not want to loan money for those projects, then the Chinese are able to charge a premium for that. So it just doesn't feel like win-win in that respect. And I think that blows a hole in that narrative. On the politics side, I do believe that politics is very much a part of these agreements. And the fact that they have these very interventionist types of clauses in there that says that if something is adverse to the interests of the People's Republic of China entity, that is so vaguely worded, it could be absolutely anything. And do you remember a couple months ago, actually maybe it was 6-7 months ago, and we talked about how I met a scholar in Peking in Beijing at Peking University at one of the think tanks there, who said that they didn't want to cancel the debt in part because they wanted to have leverage. And this was the idea that they wanted to make sure that if an African country decided to flirt with the Dalai Lama or kind of go on the wrong side of Xinjiang, it's these coercive types of policies that are there. That language is part of the coercive diplomacy that the Chinese engage. And so it might explain in part why so many African countries or developing countries are quiet on these sensitive, what I call the 4T, HK, XJ issues. Those are the core interest red lines. 4T, Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, the party, HK, Hong Kong, XJ, Xinjiang, and now the South China Sea. That's my mnemonic device that I use, 4THKXJS.
Like it's impossible to use that for me to remember.
And
like,
it's getting longer,
I can't even
too, by the
remember
way.
phrase
It
itself.
used to be just 4THK, then it became XJ, and then it became S. So who knows where this is going to go?
Like in the past, I remember sitting going like, is it 3 or 4
No,
T's?
it's 4
like,
T's.
Where does
4
the X
T's.
go?
So, but I wonder if that is part of the calculation that a lot of these smaller African governments are looking at their debt portfolios. They are actually looking at the fine print, possibly, and saying, you know what, we're not going to take an issue or position on Xinjiang because it potentially exposes our debt to big problems. I don't know if they're looking at it. It doesn't seem like they're reading the fine print very, very carefully, but I don't separate the politics from the deals. I think it's all wrapped up in one giant salad bowl.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, kind of, and I think it might not even be that they're particularly looking at these clauses in these deals. The fact that they're so dependent on trade from, you know, with China already means that they're not going to touch these red line issues, and you know, so and it all just kind of like extends leverage further and further. I think one of the big issues in relation to all of this is, again, it raises the question of why do these governments then enter into these agreements at all? And I think one answer is because they have so few options. You know, like one of the kind of most insane, I think, aspects of the entire development landscape, and one that I think that China's role as exposed, is that before China came along, it was essentially a situation where all of these different developing country government decisions about what particular way they want to move their development forward, whether they need a port or not, whether they need a dam or not, all of those decisions and all of the kind of ability to move was locked inside this kind of wider relationship between Africa and its former either colonial or kind of new imperial, you know, masters in the West. You know, there was no way of unlocking the kind of history of the relationship between Africa and those powers with the decision making of African governments now. China kind of threw a bomb into that landscape, you know, by offering another option, but when one sees how kind of unfavorable these options actually are, then it also reveals, you know, like the kind of like the narrowness of the options available to these governments to begin with.
It reminds me a little bit of, and I don't know if you have these in South Africa, but in the United States, we have these things called payday lenders. And they go into poor communities and they loan money at exorbitant interest rates. But again, they're catering to the unbanked. They're catering to people with terrible credit. They're catering to poor people who don't have any other options. So the same way that we're looking at Zambia and saying, why on God's green earth would you take a loan from the Chinese with all of these stipulations, all of these clauses? In some ways, it's like a payday lender because there's no other choice. And we look at the people borrowing from these payday lenders and think, it's 30% interest. How can you pay that back? And didn't you read the fine print? And they said, well, I needed the money right now to get out of the fix that I'm in today. And I'll worry about tomorrow. Well, tomorrow comes and you owe a lot more money. And in some ways, it's taking advantage of the poverty. And that's, again, where I think the Chinese fall short on their win-win rhetoric is, yes, there's higher risk to lending to certain African countries. But these clauses do seem like they go farther than they need to go in some instances, particularly on some of these political clauses and the limitation on some of the policy rights. It also challenges, I'd like your take on this, it really confronts the non-interference doctrine that China's so proud of not interfering in the internal affairs of other countries. But I guess that does not include when you borrow money from the Chinese. Because maybe the Chinese are connected. I mean, if you borrow money from the Chinese, they get to say in Argentina whether or not you're going to proceed with this environmentally destructive project. They get to say, if you cancel X loan, we're going to cancel, ABC loans. That is, highly interventionist in terms of their politics. So absolutely fascinating. Let's get your final thoughts before we go.
Well, I think, it's completely, it's fascinating and aspects of it is really dismaying. I think it's really important. It's going to become increasingly important for global South governments to just be a lot more scrappy and a lot more proactive. We've seen limited victories here and there. We've seen bad projects cancelled occasionally, like in Lamu in Kenya, for example. We've seen pushback from
but not because of the loan. That was canceled because of the Environmental Tribune by a court case.
Yes, but cancelled anyway. It's like we've seen pushback from newly elected leaders, like in Malaysia, for example. So there are examples, and this example of Cameroon, you disclosing all of its loan information between
Congratulations, Cameroon. Yes. Yeah. Rock on Cameroon.
Yeah, so all of those are kind of, it's possible to do. One just has to do it, and I think to take that step takes courage. These governments will have to push back not only against China but against all of these other lenders as well. It's like this: the international financing landscape is just messed up, and one needs new instruments and new forums, I think.
Credit to the Debt Management Office in Nigeria again. They are the benchmark, in my view, of debt transparency in Africa, and I think they deserve an enormous amount of credit. Shame on the U.S. and European governments for insisting on the transparency from the Chinese, but yet they themselves do not practice that, as we've heard, not only from Brad, but from any number of people. If they're going to criticize the Chinese, they need to lead by example, and they need to do a better job of making their own lending to be far more transparent than it is, not just to a team of PhD scholars at Carey who can go through databases, but simple, easy to understand ways to comprehend what they're doing, and the loans, the terms, the interest rates, all of that. So that would be very interesting to see as well. Last point is that for all the talk about the United States wanting to confront what they call the malign influence of China in Africa, it seems to me that the best thing that the United States and the Europeans and the Japanese can do if they really want to challenge the Chinese is to invest in training African negotiators so they get better deals. That is a no-brainer in my view. Give them access to the same lawyers that the Chinese are getting in London and New York and Paris. Bring them into training sessions, but not training sessions into Washington or New York. Get them training sessions with people who've actually negotiated with the Chinese. I used to work in China in a very big company, and when I was working back in the day with Ford Motor Company, and there are so many experienced people who worked with Ford who actually had all this experience managing the joint venture. Those are the kinds of people that you want to train people in Africa, not some guy from USAID who doesn't know anything about the Chinese. So really experienced people who have had experience dealing with the Chinese, negotiating with the Chinese, get them to do training sessions in places like Zambia and Botswana and other places. That, to me, would have a meaningful impact. And by the way, I suspect it will actually help the China-Africa relationship more broadly, simply because they'll get better deals. Everybody will be happy. It will be more sustainable in the long run. So that'll do it for this edition of the show. Before we go, we want to remind you about our newsletter. Cobus was talking about all the different things that he's been writing in it. He writes 2 columns a week. I write all of the other stuff every day, the deep dive into the China-Africa, China-Middle East. We talk a lot about what's going on in the Americas now. So if you're interested in what China is doing in the global South more broadly, with Africa at the heart of that, then this newsletter is perfect for you. We've got a 20% discount just for our podcast listeners because you've made it all the way till the end of the show. So we want to give you a little bit reward. And by the way, that's a 20% discount on a lifetime subscription. So year after year after year, you'll get the 20% off. Just go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. If you're a journalist, a scholar, a diplomat, you're in the aid business, you're in the intelligence business, that's the people who are reading it today. You will definitely love it. And if you're just somebody who loves international affairs and just want to follow what the Chinese are doing, then this is an ideal newsletter for you. Once again, ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Okay, Cobus and I will be back again next week with another show. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/ChinaAfricaProject to share your thoughts on today's show. Or follow the guys on Twitter. Eric's at Eolanda, and you can find Cobus at Stadenesque. For more information about the China Africa Project and to sign up for our free weekly email news brief, go to chinaafricaproject.com.